Thank you so much, and thank you each for being here. It's just so meaningful to have this great expression of interest and support. I just am just overwhelmed, and I thank you each. There are people here who are family members and friends and colleagues and former students and people I've served on committees and boards with and fellow historians. I just thank you each for your interest and for your support and for being here tonight. Give yourselves a big hand. And now if I can figure out this technology, we will see more about the Underground Railroad in Illinois. I started my, as Courtney said, I started my research in DuPage County, so I thought it would go full circle to have this presentation focus on DuPage County. Did you know that you are retracing an Underground Railroad route when you ride along Ogden Avenue or Lake Street or walk beside the DuPage River or take a commuter train into Chicago? Knowing this gives you a heightened sense of place, appreciation of feeling, Knowing this gives you a heightened sense of place, appreciation of feeling connection with history that happened here. Before the Civil War, roads, rivers, and railroads we travel today were traveled by freedom seekers escaping from bondage in the slave state of Missouri. Although I've been intrigued by accounts of the Underground Railroad since I read of Harriet Tubman during grade school, I had no idea that the Underground Railroad had operated in DuPage, Kane, Kendall, Will, and other counties in Illinois. I grew up thinking that all Underground Railroad activity was in states east of Illinois. Then in 1968, when our family moved to Wheaton, a new neighbor made a chance remark. Her name was Joyce Bryceth. Is there anyone here who remembers Joyce? No? Well, you know, whenever you move to a new town or go to a new school or a new job, invariably, even though there may be a number of people there, there's one or two people that you really connect with. And that was true of Joyce and me. And so she told me that Wheaton had been part of the Underground Railroad. I couldn't imagine that this could be true, yet she made me eager to find out. My first stop was the DuPage Historical Museum. You know, sometimes just curiosity makes you pursue something that you really would dismiss otherwise. The curator, whose name was Margaret Dutton, said there was no book on the subject, but you might find something in these two books. And she handed me Glenellen, The Story of an Old Town, and the DuPage County Guide. That's the guide that was done by the WPA. To my amazement, these books had a one-line reference here or a footnote there. This made me want to know more, and I've been searching ever since. It was almost like throwing a pebble into a puddle of water. You know, it just rippled and rippled outward. This made me realize I had to learn more about slavery and the Underground Railroad. I started looking for definitions. Abraham Lincoln's definition is the best possible one. Isn't that good? Abraham was a wordsmith. Definition of the Underground Railroad by the National Park Service is the name given to the many ways that blacks took to escape slavery in the southern United States before the Civil War. And at the end of the program, you'll see there was also an Underground Railroad in reverse. I had thought of slavery as having been limited to the southeast, but actually it was in all of the 13 original colonies. And when I stopped to think about Sojourner Truth being enslaved in New York and Phyllis Wheatley being enslaved in Massachusetts, I should have realized that. But you know how sometimes you sort of know something on this side of your head and this side of your head, but you don't put it all together, and that was the case with me. Slavery was gradually abolished in the northern states. However, there remained economic interdependence between the North and the South. An example of this is that the cotton that supplied the cotton mills in the North was picked by slave labor in the South. And these are the states that were slave states in 1790, and then in 1860. Most Illinois Underground Railroad passengers, whom I prefer to call freedom seekers, had been enslaved in Missouri. They had to assess the best time to escape, perhaps watching and waiting for years for the opportune moment, or may have had to make a split-second decision if they learned they were about to be sold. And you see that route from the Missouri River is really where the concentration of enslaved Africans were. And you see how one of the routes was to go toward the Mississippi River and then enter Illinois. There were a number of Illinois entry points. And I really kind of think of the Underground Railroad like jazz, that, you know, they talk about routes, but there were all kinds of variations of routes. And if someone felt that it wasn't safe to go their planned route, they might zigzag or even double back. There's a case of Harriet Tubman having heard that she was being tracked by a slave catcher, and she took a train south because it was believed she was taking a train north. And then there's another story about Harriet Tubman and a train. I'm not sure if this was the same trip, but she saw a slave catcher that she recognized, you know, entering the coach, and she was afraid he would see her. So she picked up a newspaper that was in the seat next to her and held it in front of her. Later, someone told her she'd held it upside down because she couldn't read. But she said he must have been illiterate too because he didn't notice. Although enslaved Africans were denied the opportunity to learn to read and write, they had and used other intelligences. For example, if a number of people were escaping in the snow, they would walk in each other's footsteps, so it would be impossible for slave catchers to know how many people had walked that way. You know, nothing that you learn is ever wasted, and I used to tell my students that. My son at one time was interested in karate and all the Oriental arts, the Oriental martial arts, and he one time he and I walked the prairie path to Glenellen, and he said, "Mama, you know, the ninja would sometimes walk in the snow, and so that it wasn't known how many people had walked that way, they would walk in each other's footsteps." So I remember that, and so when I wrote Running for Our Lives, I thought of how that was the case of people escaping together. This is an illustration from that book. And one of the greatest motivations to escape was the desire not to be separated from family. Often children were sold away from their mothers. Sometimes individuals set out for the unknown, leaving family and friends and everything that was familiar behind, with the hope of returning to rescue family or to be reunited when freedom came. Two things I'd like to say about that is at present there are a number of Underground Railroad exhibits in the Chicago area, and one is at the Holocaust Museum about people seeking to be reunited. That was, you know, just such a strong, motivating force. People couldn't really, people who were free couldn't enjoy their freedom, not knowing if family and friends were still enslaved, or if maybe they'd escaped and were nearby. You will hear later about a family that was reunited, but this is such a powerful force. Also, where it says people set out for the unknown, there's a slave narrative that was by James Pennington, and it is so poignant. He was a blacksmith, and it tells how he was going to escape, but he didn't dare tell his family or friends for fear they would be, it would be believed that they knew or had assisted him, knew where he went or had assisted him. And so he couldn't say goodbye. He was leaving everything and everybody he'd ever known and set out for the unknown because enslaved people unless they were coachmen or had had some job where they had occasion to leave the plantation, didn't know what was beyond the next stand of woods, or how deep or wide a river was, or even in what direction to go, unless they had some sense of knowing directions, such as if they knew that rivers tended to run south, then they'd figure out they could go north. But that Pennington narrative is so powerful. I really recommend it. It's an Arna Bontomp's book called Any Place But Here. I'm not sure if our library has it, but if they don't, ask them to get it. Freedom seekers survived on edible plants and often endured inclement weather. They used various means of escape. Most traveled on foot. Some were able to make some of their journey in farm wagons, by boat, or horseback, or on trains. And then this is a picture from Harper's Fair, old Harper's Weekly, that shows the family escaping by boat. And tall grasses were natural hiding places. There were many places other than, in quotes, homes that were Underground Railroad havens or safe havens. They found refuge in varied places such as barns, homes, churches, grist mills, stagecoach inns, or caves where they had to have a conversation, may have had to have a conversation with a former occupant. After crossing the mighty Mississippi River, freedom seekers who entered Illinois were sometimes assisted by black and white abolitionists when they reached Chester, Alton, Quincy, or other Illinois river towns. This is a map that was developed by Terry Ransom of Springfield. He had worked for the Department of Transportation and had occasion to travel around the state as part of his job. And in the evenings after hours, he would go in and visit or take pictures and really sometimes ring the doorbell and talk with the people who lived in homes that were believed to have been part of the Underground Railroad. And this is another example of people getting off a boat. Rivers were a natural pathway. Knowing that most waterways flow south, seekers knew the opposite way was north. Note how the Illinois River bends and branches. How many people here know Darwin Walton? She and I are friends. Well, I used to say the fact that the rivers all go toward, it seemed to slant toward Lake Michigan and Chicago, was an example of what my grandmother used to say, that the Lord works in mysterious ways. And Darwin said, everybody's grandmother said that, Glennette. So as everybody's grandmother said, this is an example of how the Lord works in mysterious ways. Chicago was the terminus of most Illinois Underground Railroad routes. Notice how most of the rivers are angled toward Chicago and Lake Michigan. I think it's singular that the terminus of the Illinois Underground Railroad is also the place that Haitian-born John Baptiste Point de Sable thought would be a pretty good location for a city. And these are routes, early roads, stage routes, and railroads. And you notice how they are almost like spokes in a wheel leading toward Chicago. Many of those roads were later paved over. So if you go down I-55 or I-90, you will know that you're retracing routes of the Underground Railroad, especially what's the I-90 that goes through Michigan toward Detroit. There used to be an Indian, it was an Indian trail that started very near Des Moines and was followed and then later paved over and became a modern highway. These are some of the, a kind of a close-up of some of the routes. Quincy was, which would have been further south, was a river entry point. It was called the #1 station of the Underground Railroad, but these are other sites as I get closer to the Chicago area. Excuse me. Excuse me. Galesburg is kind of exceptional. Many of the Underground Railroad cities or cities of haven, were along river or railroad routes, particularly water routes in the old days. But Galesburg was called an abolitionist town really because of much of the sentiment of the people who settled there, many of whom were early people on the faculty of Knox College. Then Princeton is where Owen Lovejoy lived. He was the brother of Elijah Lovejoy that, you know, was the printer whose printing press was thrown into the river and he was killed in Alton. And Owen, the younger brother, followed as an abolitionist. He married a wealthy lady in Princeton, and they had a home which you can visit to this day as a site of where the Underground Railroad operated, and has a lot of neat features. One of them is a bedroom that has a cutout behind, that's hidden behind the dresser. And so if someone, enslaved person, a self-emancipated person, was hiding in that bedroom and heard voices downstairs of concern, they could slide past that dresser and slide into an adjacent closet. And that was one of the first trips we went on. If anyone here remembers Mary Paccarelli, Mary and her sons and my sons and I went to on our very first Underground Railroad trip. And there used to be articles in the Tribune that talked about 2-hour, day trips, that you could make in 2 hours. And they had articles about saying that Princeton was one of those places. There's great antiquing there, and and it's a very nice town. And so Mary remembered that, and we'd gone to Quincy, and we drove, faster than speed limit, getting to Princeton, thinking that the Owen Lovejoy house was open to the public. When we got there, now it can be told, it wasn't open. It was up on stilts because they were raising the basement or putting a new basement in. And we were so disappointed, but we'd psyched the kids into, thinking they were going to see this exciting place. And so, as mothers trying to save face, we, told them, the kids tried to talk us into it, and as mothers trying to save face, we found a way we could go in, and we climbed in and walked close around the edges because we thought if the bottom fell out, we couldn't, complain. And we didn't even have cell phones to yell for help. And the kids saw things like radiators that had been put in the period between the time of the Underground Railroad and the time we were there. And they said, oh, that's a trap door. And that, and they had all this imagination. And Mary and I said, oh, no, that's, more modern. But then when we got to that upstairs room where the sliding door was behind the dresser, it made believers out of Mary and me. And so this is the John Hasek house. It's over the Illinois River in Ottawa, and it is also an Underground Railroad house. The National Park Service has established an Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program, and many of these houses are on that or included in that program. Recently, when the storm, there was that bad storm last winter, the Hasek house was badly damaged, but because of its historic significance, it was restored. And again, in that Running for Our Lives book, I have the Running for Our Lives is a chapter book. I had done the research for the Underground Railroad in Illinois, and actually documented information about the Underground Railroad. But having taught my first life, I knew kids liked chapter books, so I wrote this historical novel, and I had a family that was that escaped together from Missouri, but because it was a children's book, I had to get rid of the parents, and so Dr. C.V. Dyer was president of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and sometimes you transported freedom seekers on the trains to Chicago, so I put the parents on the train, and then I had the brother and sister have to make their way through Illinois. And when they got to Ottawa, to the Hasek House, the Haseks told them the next step would be, or the next place they should go was Chicago. They should head to Chicago, and they should take the towpath. And, you know, always the teacher, I had to have the kids ask, is that T-O-E or T-O-W? And, of course, then the Haseks had to explain it was what a towpath was and how, you know, they could follow on the path that ran parallel to the canal. Galesburg, as I had mentioned, was very active in the Underground Railroad, and I'll make later reference to that. Princeton, this is a picture of the day that there was received a national landmark status. And Aurora, where I went to high school, was part of the Underground Railroad. The historic Aurora Congregational Church building became an ironworks before it was eventually demolished. Within its walls, courageous anti-slavery speakers discussed the issues of the day, including such nationally known orators as Frederick Douglass. On one such visit, Douglass won General John Farnsworth over to the abolitionist cause. It was said that Farnsworth came really as a pro-slavery, or at least not an anti-slavery listener. But when Douglass spoke so poignantly of how it would be to have your wife taken away from you or your children sold, Farnsworth became such a serious abolitionist that, as you know, he headed a unit in the Civil War, and Lincoln teased him about his abolitionist regiment. These are routes as they get closer to Chicago, and you see some go south of Lake Michigan because Chicago freedom seekers weren't the only ones that knew that Chicago was the terminus of the Underground Railroad routes. So did slave catchers. And so some freedom seekers thought it was safer not to go into the city, and so they went around the lower portion of Lake Michigan toward Indiana. And there was a house there in the area near Altgill Gardens and the Beaubien Woods. And just this year, there's a group that is the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad Project, where they're beginning to do interesting things, you know, like hikes and having presentations, and I think even bird watching, for people to learn about the Underground Railroad in that area. And they hope to have to put a monument or, you know, plaque or something telling the story of John Ton. He was a Dutch farmer who had come to this country and had worked with someone who had a ferry on the Calumet River. Then you'll see some roads led directly into Chicago, and Chicago was remarkable, more so than Cincinnati, Boston, Philadelphia, in that there were people of different denominations, income brackets, races, all of whom worked together and brought to the table, you know, what they had to offer. There's a lumber yard owner in Lake Forest who had a lumber yard on the Chicago River, and ostensibly the boats that brought lumber to Chicago from the North Woods would go back empty, but in reality he allowed them to be used to transport freedom seekers to go northward. There's a transfer point at Washington Island where some freedom seekers boarded boats and went around the Upper Peninsula and on over toward Detroit in Canada. But then, because the enslaved people had done all of the work of the plantation, many people got off and, you know, became farmers and were blacksmiths, and, you know, they felt they were in a less, were pretty safely out of the reach of slave catchers, and so they, you know, started their lives there in what would that be, Michigan. Then Chicago had just a number of prominent people who were involved in the Underground Railroad, and as I said, it was really an interracial group of people who just worked so harmoniously together, and I'll go into more detail about that later. Then you see the route northward that goes kind of where you see St. Charles and Batavia and going north. And on up toward Gurnee and Waukegan. I wanted to be sure and say that St. Charles is another place that has a current Underground Railroad exhibit that has really, it's just opened this past week. And then Elgin and Dundee and Lake Zurich and Ivanhoe, all of those were places that were Underground Railroad sites and led toward that Lake Michigan area. In Waukegan, there was a lumber yard owner who had a black woman in his employee, and she would go through the streets of Waukegan followed by men whom the town people presumed were workers for the Corey was the name of the man who was the lumberyard owner, but actually there are people she was taking to the boats on Lake Michigan to escape slavery. And there are just many stories of just such creative things that were done. East and west branches of the DuPage River in towns where there was Underground Railroad activity, and you see the names of so many of the towns that we know and live in. One of my first visits was to the John Fairbanks house, and Nell Santos and I went there. There was a man named Ace Hardy, and when he was growing up, he had observed that the basement wall, which was a stone basement wall, had one stone that was exceptionally large and was not mortared. And he always intended to pull it out and, and explore, but then he grew up and went to the Army and never did. Then later, I spoke to a group of young people who were going to be camp counselors. They were teenagers, high school teenagers from West Chicago. They were going to be camp counselors that summer, but the adult who was in charge of the program wanted it to be a learning experience for them. And so he asked me to speak to them and tell them about the Ace Hardy house and about the stone. And they went in. Is Hector here? No. There's a young man, Hector Montana, who is one of those students, and we've kept in touch all these years. But they pulled out the stone and found a tunnel that they slithered around in, and it came to a larger opening where they found bones that I'm ad-libbing rather than stumbling over my reading there, it's so small. Where they found bones, and because the people from the Northern Illinois University were nearby doing a dig, they were able to carbon date it and also confirm that it wasn't from chickens who'd wandered under the house, but really bones that had been, cooked. And so they concluded that people had hidden there and had cooked food to eat while they were waiting to move on. And another thing they found was that there were seeds or remnants of seeds of tobacco, and it turns out that many enslaved people from the South had taken tobacco seeds in their pockets. They took them to Canada, and I was amazed to learn that tobacco had become one of the major products of Canada at one point. But that was, a crop that was taken in the pockets of freedom seekers. It's just all kinds of interesting, unexpected things I've learned. Warrenville in 1838, the Northern Baptist Association of Illinois met at Community Baptist Church in response to the death of Elijah Lovejoy in Alton in a resolution condemning slavery. In 1844, Warrenville was the site of the anti-slavery mass meeting of all Baptist churches in Illinois. Delegates called for establishment of anti-slavery newspaper, and the Elgin Christian began publication, 1845. Abel Carpenter of Warrenville was the brother of Philo Carpenter of Chicago, and both were dedicated abolitionists. And you'll see that list of subscribers on the Western Citizen, and you'll see A. Carpenter and another name that you'll recognize later. This is the E.C. Guild home. When I was starting my research, I met and talked with Judge Guild, and he told me about the journal that he had seen making entries that his grandparents had made. This is a little house, you know, where St. Charles Road has diagonals, goes diagonally off of and crosses North Avenue. There was this little, what looks like a, you know, a little rundown shack now was where Judge Guild had lived, but then later he moved to Wheaton so that his sons could attend Wheaton College, and then later, you know, in a later generation, he became judge. I've been interested in John Cross, and I just think any student who's wanting to do a research paper or really a thesis would be interested to learn more about John Cross. I know you.
Cross of Cross Street?
Right, right. Oh, there are a number of Wheaton streets that are named for abolition. And you know, your first thought would be the cross street is, you know, named Cross because it goes cross town. But it's just, you know, interesting to learn place names. But you see here Hiram Kellogg. You know, there's a Kellogg Street here, Cross Street, Avery, and West. Also at Wheaton College, at the entrance, there's a grave marker that was a marker of an abolitionist who wanted to be buried in Wheaton, at Wheaton College. And for years, the marker was lost, I guess, when there was new building, some way in excavation had gotten lost. So in quite recent years, it's been found again. And then it now has been rededicated and now stands at the entrance to Blanchard Hall. And this is a book. There was a book by Rufus Blanchard on the history of DuPage. It really includes a lot of details, such as the role of this E.C. Payne Freer. He's not as well known as some of the abolitionists, but I thought because he had a Wheaton connection, that it would be interesting to know of him. And also, I think he is the person that helped John Jones, who was a wealthy black tailor in Chicago that was very involved in the Underground Railroad, learn to read and write because John Jones had never had an opportunity as a youngster, although you know, he was a very astute businessman and excellent tailor. He just hadn't had the opportunity to learn to read and write. Now this is Filer, whose name you also saw on the subscription list of the Western Citizen. There was a man named George Goodrich who used to do excavation and work such as that in this area. And he had helped tear down or been involved in the tearing down of the Filer house. And he said that the wall of that large walk-in closet was lined with slough grass to muffle the sound. And, you know, it's just been interesting to learn all kinds of details like that. And then this is the Sheldon Peck House, and it too is on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Register. The interesting thing about that is Sheldon Peck's paintings were very much kind of like the period of Grandma Moses, and he painted a lot of pictures of abolitionists, and there usually were pictures of individuals, you know, portraits of a husband or a husband or of a wife. But the one exception I found was the John Wagoner family in Aurora. And John Wagner had a copy of the Western Citizen folded on his lap, but only the word citizen showed because the paper was folded in half and you could only see a portion of the headline of the title. And Margot Free, who was a volunteer at the Sheldon Peck House, thought that must be the Western Citizen, and she started researching. She found that the subscription list to the Western Citizen was at the Chicago, if it was Chicago Historical Society, I guess it's now the Chicago Museum of History, or History Museum. But it just opened up the whole, research into so many aspects of Sheldon Peck's Underground Railroad activities. And it's just, like, again, just a kernel of information, or the pebble that ripples outward, however you'd want to say. And Downers Grove, Israel Blodgett, and AVIS Blodgett are well known. And recently, there's been a plaque this past year. There was a monument actually in the graveyard that honors his work. He's the founder. There's a lovely story of something that reportedly took place at the front door of the Blodgett's house. A man who'd been enslaved in Missouri got his freedom but remained there, believing he had a gentleman's agreement with his wife's slaveholder. The man promised to purchase his wife's freedom from money he earned as a free man. He kept his end of the bargain, but when he went for his wife, the slaveholder had sold her. Discouraged, the man escaped, came to the home of Deacon William Strong and Big Woods, which is Eola. Deacon Strong brought the man to the Blodgetts, and as he stood at the door explaining what happened, by wonderful coincidence, the man's wife had escaped and was inside the house. She heard her husband's voice, and they were reunited to live their lives together in freedom. I just think that is so beautiful. I just have goosebumps as I read it. Before automobiles came into use, travelers between Aurora and Naperville especially welcomed the sight of the halfway house, knowing their 2-hour trip was half over. It was rumored that the home was also Underground Railroad station. Imagine what a happy sight it was to freedom seekers who had traveled all the way from Missouri. It was a common practice for slaveholders to hire out or enlist enslaved people, then collect their wages or pensions. It was what happened to Israel Blackburn, whose slaveholder sought to profit $300 for enlisting him in the Union Army. Blackburn was, that doesn't even sound fair to even first graders, Blackburn was a signer of Downers Grove Papers of Incorporation. He earned his living as a salary farmer, and he's buried in the Downers Grove Cemetery. I made a typo there with the G. But it's interesting, his grave faces a different way from the graves of all the other people in the graveyard, so that is interesting. And there's his picture, and there's his gravestone. Pierce Downer's house in Downers Grove was also believed to have been an Underground Railroad. And Ogden Avenue was, what later was then called the Southwest Highway, and the stagecoach route, and Pierce Downer's home is quite near that. In 1833, Alexander Howard built his frame home to serve as a local stop and postal station for the Templeton stagecoach route between Chicago and Ottawa, named for the grove of pawpaw trees growing around the building once located at 143 Jefferson Avenue. It was called the Pawpaw Post Office. It was later relocated to Napier Settlement. It and some other stops are believed to have been an Underground Railroad station. Soon after I began my research on the Underground Railroad, Jim Gibbons of ABC interviewed me at Pawpaw Post Office when it was on Jefferson. There was a rocking chair that sat on top of a small round rug. There was a trap door beneath the rug, and reportedly that trap door was used by freedom seekers to descend to the hiding place in the basement. So Jim Gibbons had an assistant go down to the basement. And after he and I began talking, we moved the chair off the rug, lifted the rug, and the assistant pushed up from the cobweb-covered trap door, and it creaked all appropriately. The next day, Jim Gibbons called to say that he had received a call from two sisters whose family used to live in the house. One claimed that their mother had told her that it was a root cellar. The other said their father had told her that it was entrance to the Underground Railroad hiding place. Might they both be right? And there's a pop-up. These are courtesy of Napier Settlement, these beautiful pictures. In my early study, I went to Napier Settlement and saw the Les Schrader painting of Avis Blodgett standing up to a slave catcher who had asked for water for himself. According to oral historians, Avis got water and gave it to two enslaved African men who were tethered to the bounty hunter's horse. Reportedly, she told him he was free, go get water for yourself. Eola is the location of the William Strong House. And this stood, for over 100 years, beautiful house, lots of interesting outbuildings, and there was a crossroads with other roads leading in, and it's on New York, what is now New York, faced what is now in New York Street. I just thought it, would be there forever. But one time I was doing a tour for Newberry Library and was doing a drive-through in advance, planning the stops and the distance time, we needed to allow between them. And I stopped at the Eola post office, and the postmistress, I told her I was going by the Strawn House. She said, well, you're going to find out it's not there. Either they needed a new Walgreens or a parking lot, so they knocked down that old building. And I was just heartsick, to just think of the history that it represented. This is a story that's one of the most dramatic stories of the Underground Railroad. Caroline Quarles escaped from Missouri, and she reached Milwaukee and was hiding in a hotel. And someone who was at the hotel knew that they would be reimbursed or get, some payment if they turned her in. So when slave catchers came looking for her, they said that she was there. But fortunately, abolitionists rescued her by taking her back into Illinois towns, and including Dundee, Naperville, and then they went to Will County and Crete in Will County before heading back north. And I've had a chance to meet one of her descendants. And also, if you're interested in learning more about her story, Larry McClellan has done a lot of research and is working with that descendant to write a book about Caroline Quarles. But this is from the journal of one of the abolitionists, Lyman Goodnow, and you'll see where he stopped in Naperville. And then this is a 10-mile house in Maywood. If you are at the corner of First Avenue and Lake Street, which is very near where St. Charles Road and Lake Street converge, there is a McDonald's. And McDonald's later learned that this house had stood on that footprint, and there was a young black architect by the name of Michael Rogers who designed the McDonald's and was asked to design a monument. And he did just the most wonderful and symbolic monument. It is right at the edge of the Des Plaines River. It's right where Lake Street, crosses the river, and the train line, what was our old Northwestern, runs within a half block of that. So it's, with the land, the overland route that wagons might have taken or a person might have taken walking, the river and the railroad. Arthritis won't let me do that other finger. But it's wonderful. So I often say that you could take a peanut butter jelly sandwich and sit on the bench and reflect if you didn't want to buy a hamburger, or you could patronize McDonald's and you know, and visit it. And Oak Brook, the Growing Mill, is the site that's best known. The miller, Frederick Growe, housed freedom seekers in the basement of the mill on Salt Creek. Farmers from throughout the area brought their grain to the mill on the upper floors. Some were Underground Railroad workers and others were pro-slavery, so he heard all the conversations. Freedom seekers could follow the winding creek to the Des Plaines River, then northward to a point, Portage Point towards Chicago, or nearby Southwest Highway, now known as Ogden, into Chicago, where they could be aided by black and white Underground Railroad workers. Hinsdale blacksmith John Coe was the local conductor. Each year in the late summer, early autumn, there is an evening journey on the Underground Railroad at the Growe Mill. Journey goers of all ages, should be of all ages, that was typo, vicariously experience what it must have been like to experience an escape on the Underground Railroad. The program begins with a tent meeting where stories of the Underground Railroad told and spirituals that were so meaningful to freedom seekers are sung. Then John and Harriet Coe come into the actors, of course, into the tent and invite the journeygoers to follow them to the Salt Creek, where he is expecting a freedom seeker to arrive. And then, of course, there's a dog barking, and you'll have to go and find out what happens. The Charles Volney Dyer was known as president of the Illinois Underground Railroad and was instrumental in bringing the Western Citizen to Chicago. The Western Citizen was kind of the official organ of the anti-slavery movement here in Chicago, kind of like the North Star was in Boston, the Western Citizen was here. The home of Dyer's brother used to sit up on overlooking I-55, and my friend Susan made it possible for me to go and see this house moved. She had purchased a house and had it moved for $1, a house in Downers Grove. So she knew the house mover, and so when he was going to move this house, she called. But you look over on the far corner, you see an arch way down on the underground level. That was much better than would have finished arch than it would have needed to be if it had been a root cellar. Susan and I, really believed that that was used by Underground Railroad because all the Dyers were so involved and dedicated to the Underground Railroad. We just were so sorry that the warehouse that was hurrying to have it, the ground filled in and the house moved, hurried and did it, and so that's covered and lost forever. This is an old train entering Chicago, and you see the coaches. C.V. Dyer had that roundhouse that is now the Aurora train station as the place where, the coaches were built. It was really the center of his operations of Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. And as I said, the enslaved people did all the work on the plantation, so there were carpenters and blacksmiths, and I just, really believe that he probably employed a number of people to build coaches such as those in Aurora, and then, of course, many maybe moved on to Canada. I'll just let you read this. Are you ready for the next? And now this is the Liberty line. And you see the little tunnel and the train going through the tunnel where it's kind of a play on, it's a political cartoon of the early days. And you see John Cross's name listed as proprietor. I don't know if you can see the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act, but really it was just so punitive. And I've been interested in how Illinois senators have been so involved. You know, Stephen A. Douglas was very instrumental in getting this through the Congress. And then Paul Simon was the senator who wrote the legislation that made it possible for the National Park Service to do the Underground Railroad study and work that it's done. And then Carol Moseley Braun helped get the legislation through to establish the Network to Freedom. And so it's just, you know, again, been interesting to see all these interconnections. All I was only doing to say that on one of the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act was that a person could be punished with $1,000 or 6 months in jail. And most people were farmers. You know, there's no 6 months of the year they could afford to be away from their farms. But African Americans who were involved in the Underground Railroad faced all of those risks. And even if they had freedom papers, a slave catcher could just take the freedom papers and tear them up, and, you know, it would be the African Americans' word against the slave catchers. And so it was really very perilous and, you know, very courageous work on the parts of everyone involved. John Jones was one of the people, and he's the person that Freer taught to read, and their home was a gathering place. It was down near, you know, where the Dearborn Street train station is at the end of, down by Printers Row, is where the Joneses lived, and there's a Mary Jefferson Jones Park in that area. He did a lot to have the black codes of Illinois removed. And this is his wife. And they entertained Susan B. Anthony and, you know, many notable people who were not only in the abolitionist movement, but in women's suffrage movement, and you know, just so many of the freedom movements, temperance movement. Alan Pinkerton we know from Dundee, but he was very much involved in the Underground Railroad. His D. Baptiste brother had an excursion boat line in Detroit, and by day it was an excursion boat line, but by night he and other Underground Railroad workers would transport freedom seekers to Canada. And they just did such, you know, involved things as putting gunny sacks on the hoofs of the horses so they wouldn't make sounds as they went through the cobblestone streets. The Hudlins, if you saw DeSable to Obama on WTTW the other night, you heard me comment on the Hudlins. Mrs. Hudlin is supposed to be on that picture, but I kind of ran out of time, and I regret that I wasn't able to figure out how to get her picture on beside her husband. But she was called the Angel of the Chicago Fire because they housed so many people who'd lost their homes. The men of Quinn formed an organization where they acted as night watchmen as the populace slept following the Fugitive Slave Act. You know, they just didn't know when slave catchers might come into town, and so they acted as night watchmen and alerted the sleeping residents if they needed to move on. And this is a page from the Chicago Tribune the very day before Fort Sumter, where a family that had made it safely to Chicago was betrayed and recaptured and sent back into slavery. Ready? That was quite a transformation, wasn't it? They said that Harriet Tubman had whelps on her back to the rest, all of her life, too. This kind of recaps the role of African Americans in the Civil War. I won't read that aloud or give you an assignment of doing it. And this is the Underground Railroad in reverse. During the Civil War, there was an Underground Railroad in reverse. Enslaved Africans hid, fed, and provided nursing care to Union soldiers who'd gotten separated from their units, and using back roads led them back to their units, and of course stayed with them. And that's the end of the story. The journey continues.